My name is Richard Blanco. I grew up in Miami, out west in a town area called Westchester, or as the Cubans like to say, Westchester. I actually started writing much later in life, not in high school, and it was after I graduated from my engineering degree. I realized how much writing there was in my consulting office. I was writing letters and proposals and permitting applications and all this stuff, and realizing that I had to put language to abstract concepts, and I had to use language to, get that job, and I had to use language to get that permit. And I started falling in love with language, realizing the subtleties of language and the idea of audience and tone, and how you write a letter to a council member at Coral Gables, city of Coral Gables, is different than the way you would write something to a permitting agent. And I just started falling in love with language. And from then forward, I started saying, well, what else can I do with language, I thought. And I started, as I like to say, fooling around with poetry, doodling around with poetry. And slowly throughout the months and years, eventually I got real serious about it and started going to classes at Miami-Dade College, and then eventually at the FIU Masters in Fine Arts program. And the rest, as they say, is history. But I was doing it mostly, and I think I always never lost sight of that, just for fun, just for the sheer pleasure of what language was doing, and how much I was learning about myself and the world by having to write a poem. A lot of people have asked me, wow, you only had 3 weeks to write 3 poems, arguably the most important poem of my entire life, and it is. And so I know what you guys are going through right now, but believe me, it'll be fine. I think, ironically, if this is of any help, sometimes having a limited time can be very helpful, because something about giving yourself those limits makes you dig into the deepest parts of yourself, and you know when a draft is not going anywhere, you just throw it right away. Don't panic with that. Take that as a real positive thing, because it's going to make you really focus, and you'd be surprised what the outcome is. There is something great to be said about what I call the timed exercise, and you certainly have have a limited amount of time, but that brings out the best in us. So think about that as you write. Think about, I know this is short, I know this is going to be a little bit of time, and I know it's hard, but it's going to bring out, just believe and have faith that timing, that short amount of time, is actually going to bring out the best in you. So throughout the years, rhyme has dropped off quite a bit, at least end rhyme, the idea that, of a specific end rhyme pattern. Now, when you are writing for an oral performance, and to me this is sometimes I make a judgment based on, for example, the inaugural poem I realized was a spoken word poem, because it was one of the first pieces that was going to be heard before it would ever be read. So I had to capture the imagination of people through sound, through musicality. I didn't use rhyme per se, straightforward, end rhymes. I don't typically write like that unless I'm writing in a form like a villanelle or a sonnet, or any one of those forms that prescribe rhyme. What I encourage people to do is to use rhyme, but not worry about the ending rhyme word. That feels sometimes a little forced, but sometimes they're great. And the other thing about rhyme that I have to be conscious about when I do use it is it has to be a good rhyme. I mean, we've been rhyming for so many hundreds of years that sometimes some of the rhymes seem, sky and pie and die, those kinds of rhymes are not as interesting as some of the more surprising rhymes. 2 words that people are 2 words that listeners might put together that sound like a fresh rhyme, something that doesn't seem so overused. So that's another way to work within rhyme. But I would always tell people to feel free not to use rhyme, because that doesn't mean that the poem doesn't have musicality. Rhyme is not the only device to create rhythm and musicality in a poem. There's assonance and consonance, internal rhyme. There's all sorts of ways in which rhythm and musicality comes into a poem. The minute rhyme starts limiting what you want to say, because you're just working towards the rhyme, I think you got to be careful about that. Now, if you can come up with the rhyme and not sacrifice what it is you want to say, then you've got something really great going. At FIU, Our very first assignment, actually, I think in my very first class, was write a poem about America. That prompt, that assignment really started making me think, am I Cuban, am I American? Both, neither. Really started getting me to investigate this idea of who I am, where I'm from, what is home, where do I belong? And it's still to this day the sort of central theme and obsession of my work. It's a question that really has no final answer. But art is not about finding a final answer, but about just exploring possibilities and expanding one's ideas or thoughts. And so I still write about those same themes. It's really started me getting on that, focusing the work on something particular, as if we could write about everything in the world. How do you focus on something that's really passionate and personal to you? Cousin Consuelo on piano. Por favor, Consuelo, play something for la familia, her mother begged, until she stomped to the bench, bored us with some waltz. I asked for a crocodile rock, but she didn't know it, or so she said, hammered out a mambo instead, her waist-long hair swaying like a metronome, keeping tempo, and everyone 2, 3 flooring around the coffee table. I asked for Muskrat Love, but she kept the frenzy going with a paso doble, setting off a chorus of ole, 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 ringside at a bullfight, tossing out roses. Margaritaville, I pleaded, but she followed with the sweet and slow honey of a bolero. Okay, one more and that's it, she warned. I yelled for American Pie, but the crowd demanded Guantanamera, that damn song about Cuba they all knew by heart. Guantanamera! My mother slapped my fingers out of my ears, made me sit on my hands. I had to listen to my grandmother caterwaul, dabbing the corners of her eyes, her voice cracking over a country I didn't know, yet had to love like the Amiri did. Singing about El Campo I never saw, yet had to feel in Consuelo's notes rising into mountains, resting in valleys. The click of her nail tips on the keys like rain falling in the room and on my father. I had to watch him sink into the sofa, clutch his whiskey, follow her fingers rippling left, rippling right. I had to sing with him. Like a real Cuban, I had to feel displaced, broken, beautiful, and clap for more. Had to make Consuelo play Guantanamera twice, 3 times, until she stuffed the sheet music back into the bench, marched to her room, leaving all of us and the piano, a dumb black box without her. Whenever I write, I mean, whenever we listen to poetry, we have to recognize that poetry is, in some way, always has to honor this idea of music, of musicality. And it's something that I've always sort of tried to recognize in my work. For example, when I always use this analogy, when I'm starting a poem, it almost feels like I'm trying to tune an instrument and I'm trying to get that right first note, or I'm just trying to, I can't hear it. It sounds off key. And then there's a moment when that first line comes to your head, that there's this musicality, there's this sense of, I can finally hear my voice. I can finally hear that music, that internalized music that is my voice, Richard Blanco. And usually that's the breaking point for a poem. And from then on forward, it feels like, okay, now I can start writing this song, this poem. The other thing that I connect music and poetry with is I always revise for sound. I mean, a poem isn't a poem until it's read out loud. And this is something that I've come to believe, certainly throughout the past decade, more and more, and recognizing more and more. You know, when you read a poem out loud, whether it's your own or somebody else's, there's something amazing that happens, because that poem now becomes part of your physiology. And the more you read that poem, the more you gain this sort of muscle memory. Your diaphragm knows how to read the poem, how to emphasize certain words. Now the poem is part of your body. And when you think about that, isn't that what singing a song is like? Isn't that when performers get on stage to sing a song? It's the same idea that comes back. It's pretty amazing. And over time, if I rehearse that poem out loud enough, it becomes different on the page for me than when I come to sing it, so to speak. So I think that I usually, once I write a poem on the page, I'll start revising for sound. I'll start reading it out loud, seeing if my body's not responding to it right, if the breaths aren't right, if something's not happening, then I usually think I got to go back to this poem on the page and see what's going on with that. I recommend that to, even when you read somebody else's poetry, read it out loud. You'll be surprised. You'll be surprised what opens up in your understanding. You're understanding the poem now in a different way. I always use this analogy as well. So sometimes, you know, how we have some favorite songs, and sometimes we're not sure exactly what the songs mean, and sometimes we even like or sing lyrics and we realize years later that we've been singing the wrong lyric. But why do we still enjoy the song? The sound has a meaning in and of itself. It's a meaning it's a visceral response to the poem. And gosh darn it, if that's not what a song, what a poem can do as well, when just hearing it, just like a song, I think when you read a poem out loud, that can happen too. That magic starts to happen. And there's poems that I love that I just enjoy for pure sound, like especially poets like E. E. Cummings. You know, my father moved through dooms of love, through sames of am, through halves of give. I have no idea what that means. I just love that sound, and I love saying it out loud. I sometimes use words not only because of their meaning, but because of the meaning they impart to the poem in terms of their sound. Of course, it's a tricky balance because there has to be meaning and sound and musicality all work together. So sometimes, you know, if you're writing a poem that wants to be more dreamy or more, say, aloof a little bit, I'll use words that have sort of more S sounds, and I'm not sure I do this completely consciously, but words that have sort of a melodious sound to them. If I want to write a poem that has a little bit more of a sort of a in-your-face kind of tone, or something that's a little bit more angry, I try to use words that sound to my ear as if it's like they're much more like heartbeats, or like hammers coming down. Words like that end with T's and P's and things like that. I think for me a poem is born, first of all, from sort of a raw sort of emotion. So I feel something about a memory that flashes back at me, or I feel like a situation I'm in right now is really sort of causing me a lot of angst or joy, or an emotion that I can't quite grasp around, or it's a person in my life. And so for that, the poem begins with this sort of raw emotion, this raw sort of idea, this obsession that comes to mind. The poem, when I enter the poem, I don't enter the poem knowing exactly what I feel. I just know that what I want to do is enter the poem so that I can understand better about how I feel. So poetry, or writing a poem, is not just sort of about what I need to discover by myself, but how can I communicate that and share that with someone else so that maybe they can also feel something about their lives. And in that way, I've always approached the poem in some way as a mirror. Kind of the motivation also behind poetry, behind the way I write, why I write, is the idea that, yes, we're trying to find something deeply intimate and personal about ourselves and learn something about ourselves, but we want to share that. We want it to transcend that. And I find that it's that's what makes it so magical. It's the idea of how you can connect. One of the pitfalls about writing poetry is to sort of, at some point, always disregard the listener or disregard the reader and be a little too self-absorbed and not realize that as artists, as poets, what we're doing is sort of offering our lives up as not quite an example, but as an experience, as something to share around the campfire, so that others might connect with themselves, with the other people around the campfire, and it's a communal event. In some ways, I always feel that way. When I read poems, when I have a reading, that sort of comes full circle to me. The poem isn't really alive until that connection. Until I can witness that connection, or I should say, it becomes most alive when that happens.